All right, everybody, welcome back into Cherry Picking. Today's video, we hit pretty much the second half of the season mark. Most teams have played at least 40 games. I think the Ottawa Senators, they're the only exception to that number right now, but pretty much second half of the season. So we're going to be looking at the easiest and hardest schedules for the rest of the season, the top 5 in both of those categories, to see if you have players in either or, if there's some players you maybe need to get rid of because of how tough their opponents are for the rest of the season, or on the other side of that, if a team and player has some really plus advantage matchups, then definitely try to be targeting them, even going deeper into their lineups to find some gems that could be good in certain weeks in terms of a streamer or whatnot. So 5 teams to look at for the easiest schedule, 5 teams to look at for their hardest schedules. Let's get into today's video. All right, so looking at the 5 easiest schedules here, the first one being the San Jose Sharks. Obviously, you're not going to put a ton of stock into that. You can kind of tell by the teams that they played at the beginning of the season when they're on that huge losing streak. It was pretty apparent that they were playing the toughest part of their schedule. The second half of their schedule, they get a little bit lucky. They play the bottom feeders in the Pacific and the Central there in the West. Definitely, I would say, not as balanced between the East and the West this season. The West, there's a lot of bad teams at the bottom there. In the East, there's really not like a ton. Like even Columbus has been pretty decent this year. Montreal, one of those teams, also there. But the Sharks, they get the Blackhawks 3 times in the second half of the season, the Ducks 3 times, the Jackets twice, and then again, a bunch of other plus matchups here. The only 2 fantasy players you'd be looking at on the San Jose Sharks would be Tomas Hertl and Granlund. That's pretty much it. And then Mario Ferraro as well, because he is in a Bangers League. If you are in a Bangers League, Mario Ferraro is definitely a guy you're going to want to be looking at. I'm not putting in faith in Duclair or Zetterlund or William Eklund. Even with the soft schedule, I don't think those guys really carry enough volume to be worth it. And then even looking in terms of goaltenders, Blackwood or Capo Kakinen are definitely not goalies that I'm going to be looking at in the second half of the season. Even with their soft schedule, it's just not really worth it. Looking at the Anaheim Ducks, they have the second easiest schedule. So you see kind of a common theme here. 2 teams that have really not had a good start to their seasons have really favorable matchups for the rest of the year. The Ducks have a little bit more variety and players you can kind of pick from for the second half of the season here. Like Vetrano's obviously been great. He's like a top 60 fantasy hockey player depending on your league settings. Troy Terry has been relatively inconsistent. Adam Henrique's a really interesting name. And then Mason McTavish, just coming back. I think he's definitely a guy that you can continue to play in those really plus matchups, and they have a lot of them in the second half of the season. Adam Henrique is actually, I think, is a really interesting option because he is one of the names that is definitely getting thrown around there in terms of a veteran that could be traded to a contender. If he stays on the Ducks, I say he's fantasy relevant. If he moves to a contender, he'll probably be on the third line and not playing a whole lot. So I don't think that's necessarily feasible if he does get moved. And then on the defensive side of things for the Ducks, Gudas and maybe Minchikov are the 2 guys I'd maybe be looking at. Trevor Zegras, obviously hurt right now. He's on the trade block as well. So don't really think this guy's going to be fantasy hockey relevant for the rest of the year, considering he is on the Anaheim Ducks as well. The most interesting one here is the third on the list. The Los Angeles Kings could be a lot of sneaky value here because there's a ton of players on this list that I think kind of fit the quota of being rosterable. It starts with Kempe, Anze Kopitar, Trevor Moore, Kevin Fiala, Drew Doughty, Quentin Byfield, even Phil Deneau, I think, isn't even a stretch to put in there considering, his face-offs and a lot of the other good things that Phil Deneau does. He's been able to score, plays. Pretty much any center on this team will play with 2 really caliber wingers, guys who can score at will. Like even if you're playing on the 3rd or 4th line with Arthur Kaliev, that's a guy who's an absolute rocket and was rolling at the beginning of the year as well. Talbot, I'd go and get right now because he's been kind of struggling. And then a guy on your waiver wire that you can definitely stream because he's been so good as their backup is David Rittich. Doesn't really matter who's playing in net for this Kings team because their defensive unit is so solid on that back end that I think that any goalie can really play well. Like Cam Talbot isn't a Vezina caliber goalie and he's playing like it this year because of such a good structure and team played game that Todd McClellan kind of advocates for on this Kings team. So definitely a lot of players to go through there on the Los Angeles Kings side of things. 8 of their games include games against Blackhawks, Sharks, and the Ducks. That's a fourth of the rest of their games of the season. So a lot of great opportunities there for a ton of fantasy points from those players. So if you can target LA Kings players, definitely try to. I think you can even if you have to pay a little bit more of a premium for them, I think it's worth it. On the Minnesota Wild things, 4th easiest remaining schedule. I love Joel Eriksson Ek for the second half of the season. I think he's going to be a huge difference maker to help this team make a playoff push. I don't think they're necessarily going to make it in the playoffs at this point. I think the 8 teams that are in the playoffs in the West right now are actually probably going to be the 8 teams that play in the playoffs, but there could be some change along the way there. Wild definitely have a good chance considering kind of who they have for the rest of the season here. So Eriksson Ek definitely a guy to be looking at. Matt Boldy, I've talked about him in my second half buy lows. Zuccarello's just coming back from injury. He's great. Brock Faber, and then Marco Rossi as well is a guy who's been moved up and down the lineup throughout the season, playing on the first line, playing on the third third line. Ryan Hartman coming back from injury, I think will also be a guy that you can kind of look at, maybe even pick up and stream as well, depending if in your 10 to 12 man leagues. And then I know Gustafsson is just coming back from injury, but I still think he's going to be the number one guy for the rest of the season. Jesper Wallstedt came up and played from the AHL, but kind of looks like he's not really ready yet. It's tough to say. It was just one game, and the Wild weren't particularly playing very well either. And then Fleury as well. I wouldn't really consider Fleury fantasy relevant. I would just kind of hang my hat on Philip Gustafsson and hope he gets a majority of the starts in the second half of the season. And then the last team on this list that we're looking at are the Seattle Kraken. Vince Dunn has been awesome. He leads this team in fantasy points, depending on your league settings, but pretty much, I'm pretty sure he leads this team in points as well. He's been awesome. Top 15 D-man in fantasy hockey points this year. Oliver Bjorkstrand doesn't fall too far behind him. Matty Beniers continues to just not be a player that's really fantasy hockey relevant for whatever reason. He's great, but he's definitely having a little bit more of a sophomore slump this season. Jared McCann, considering the teams the Kraken play in the second half of the season, could absolutely be a buy low here, considering his 40-goal season last year. And on the year, I think he only has 16 goals to this point through 41 games. And then you had Adam Larsson. Adam Larsson and Vince Dunn are like the perfect opposites for this Kraken team. Adam Larsson, so valuable in bangers leagues, and Vince Dunn, so valuable in points leagues in terms of the defenseman. Joey Decord, obviously a guy you're going to want to keep on your team now, considering how well he's been playing, and then looking at who they play for the rest of the season as well. It's really a team that doesn't create a lot of offense, so you're really depending on those guys like Adam Larsson and Joey Decord to get you wins. You're not going to be looking from the forward group, but there are definitely some favorable matchups here that I would take a look at. Some Seattle Kraken players, even Yanni Gourde was a guy I was suggesting to pick up in my must-add, considering who they play this week. I think there's a lot of favorable matchups, and he's been scoring at will for this Kraken team since the start of the new year here. So there's a lot of players you can look at. Jared McCann would probably be my favorite on the Kraken. Obviously looking to Joey Decord. He's been playing like prime Ken Dryden recently, but overall I think it's a very small list on this Seattle team. All right, now we're looking at the 5 teams that have the hardest remaining schedules, and a lot of these teams, it's definitely going to hurt, I think, some of these fantasy hockey players' impacts on your teams for the rest of the season. Like, there's just a lot of really good hockey teams that have had pretty much the easiest first half part of their seasons, and now you see teams here on this list, the Leafs, the Bruins, the Devils even on this list. The Canucks aren't too far off this top 5 either. You have teams like the Capitals and the Canadiens where there's not a ton of fantasy hockey relevance there, but this is concerning even for Leafs, Bruins, and I would say Devils fans as well, especially Devils fans, considering they don't currently have a playoff spot, and a majority of their players or good players are injured right now too. So let's look at the Leafs right now. Obviously, doesn't change too much in terms of who you're going to be starting fantasy hockey wise. You're still playing Marner, Matthews, Nylander, Tavares, and Morgan Riley, but I'd stop there. Especially guys like, Matthew Nyes, Tyler Bertuzzi. I think it's too hard. You obviously now too, with Sheldon Keefe, dropped an absolute kamikaze bomb on these lines to play against Detroit, putting Holmberg on the first line, Matthew Nyes on the fourth line, really switching up. Marner not playing with Tavares either here. So the one person that might really get hurt by this is when Wall comes back. If they play all these tough matchups here, he might not have the same numbers we saw him have before he got hurt. I don't see Keefe really relying too heavily on Samsonov for the rest of the season, but Martin Jones been fine. He just started 7 straight games, so he's definitely able to carry on the workload. So you could see these guys maybe splitting time for the rest of the season when Wall comes back to, just make sure there is no one injured for the playoffs. But maybe my bias is showing here, but the fact that the Leafs have the hardest remaining schedule and they're 1 spot or 1 point inside of a playoff spot right now with 50 points. Both wildcard teams are at 49 points. Looking at the Leafs to miss the playoffs at 5-1, not a horrible decision, not a horrible bet. I would probably will take that, to be honest. So considering how poor they've been, I would say recently, looking at their last couple games against Detroit, Colorado, I think it's a good chance to maybe take a stab on it. Another team that I think's also been overperforming, but a team that definitely kind of built their lead in the first half of the season with their easy schedule, and that's the Boston Bruins, 59 points on the year so far. But with the second hardest remaining schedule for the rest of the year, fantasy hockey-wise, there's not a ton of guys you're relying on this year. Obviously, both goaltenders, when Allmark comes back, you can continue to start those guys. That's not going to change. Marchand, Pasternak, Charlie McAvoy maybe are really the 3 I'd look at, and then Charlie Coyle has been able to fill in well. Pavel Zacha's hurt now, but he's been rather inconsistent even before his injury there. Guys like Jake DeBrusk, JVR aren't consistent enough, both sub 30 points on the season through 40 games or 41 games, whatever you want to call it there. Swayman and Allmark, as I mentioned, fine. A lot of tough Western Conference teams to play, though, for Boston. They have Winnipeg, Vancouver twice, Colorado, the Stars, the Panthers twice, twice as well. I know that's on the Eastern Conference. Panthers are like playing like one of the best teams in hockey right now too. So a little bit to worry about for Bruins fans, but I think the status quo kind of remains the same for the Bruins fantasy hockey players for the rest of the season here. Looking at the Capitals, I think it stays the same as well. Like, not a ton is changing here. You might not have as many like streamer picks to kind of look at on this team. You know, Tom Wilson was a guy I was looking at to be like a second half buy low. Doesn't really seem like that's going to be the case. He's been rather disappointing really since that video has dropped, and the Capitals have been relatively competitive as well. John Carlson's a guy you're going to continue to start. Ovechkin, you could start just solely based on his shots on goal. I know he's not scoring a ton this year, but he's still being able to get points here and there, and then his shots on goal are still at a very high number too. But guys with like Strome, Pacioretty, Connor McMichael, too inconsistent to really have a full roster spot. Stream them maybe when you can in certain scenarios when you're playing, when they have advantage matchups or plus matchups, excuse me. So I'd leave it at those three with Carlson, Ovechkin, and Tom Wilson. Tom Wilson even on the outside looking in as well. Just an absolute gauntlet this team has to churn through for the second half of the season. Jets, Canucks, Avalanche, Panthers, and Bruins all at least 2 times in the remaining 40 games of the season. They haven't really done their big Western Conference road trip either. One other thing to note, Charlie Lindgren has been great, but if you have him right now, he's definitely due for a guy you could sell high on him, because the rest of the season is going to be much harder than the first half of the season, considering a big Western Conference road trip, considering the teams they have to play as well. So definitely someone I'd be looking to sell high on. I suggested to buy low on Kemper. You know, that was a horrible decision. I thought Lindgren was going to be out for longer for whatever reason, but Darcy Kemper, again, hasn't had his best season. Put that on top of the fact that he has to go up against an absolute gauntlet for the rest of the season as well. Not a guy I'd be looking at to add. Okay, for the Canadians, we'll keep this super quick. Mike Matheson, Cole Caulfield, Nick Suzuki. 3 guys. Leave Sean Monahan off it. He had a great start to the year. No one else really is getting the volume that you need on such a bad team that you need to roster. You know, Matheson deserves it because he plays a ton, gets hits, shots, blocks, you know, power play points. Caulfield shoots a ton, is always in scoring opportunities for this Canadians team as well. Suzuki, even I would, depending on how many people are in your league, he's probably on the waiver wire there as well. So definitely only a couple of players that are feasible on this Montreal Canadiens team. Jake Allen and Montembeault, these guys could be interesting because their names are definitely being moved around in trade talks and could be moved before March. Jake Allen, a guy who's a little bit more pricey than Sam Montembeault in terms of his contract. I think he's on his deal is about 3.8, so that's a bigger cap hit than a lot of teams can take on at this time of the year. So Montembeault, a guy that could be moved if he is moved to a contender, you know, with a solid defensive unit in front of him. He's definitely a guy you could potentially pick up. So not a guy you need to hold on to. Neither is Jake Allen, but just keep that in mind as the month of February goes along here, and January as we get into March, and you're looking for goalies, or if you need goalies for a playoff run or what it may be, these 2 guys could be on your watch list. All right, and the last team on this list, the 15th, or the team with the 5th hardest remaining schedule, is the New Jersey Devils. So obviously you have a bunch of injuries right now with Jack Hughes, Timo Meier, Dougie Hamilton, but really those are the guys you're going to be relying on for this Devils team. Even with Jack Hughes, Meier, and some of these guys out, Toffoli really has been disappointing this year. Had great analytics to start the year. I thought we'd see him kind of break through, but there was a little bit of an indication from last season that we would have seen some regression, especially coming onto a team where there's a lot of mouths to feed in terms of scoring. Toffoli had a really high expected goals number, you know, before December or right in December, a guy I would be looking at to kind of trade for, but he just hasn't turned that into any positive goals right now. So even with Hughes out, you think that total will maybe go up, still has not. So Jack Hughes is obviously, when he comes back, you're keeping him in every single lineup. You're playing Nico Hischier as well. Jesper Bratt's been great, and the only really guy scoring goals for this Devils team since those top players have been out. And then Luke Hughes and Simon Nemec, 2 guys that you could potentially play. Luke Hughes for sure. Nemec is like really streaky in terms of kind of where his point production comes from, but he is playing more minutes actually than Luke Hughes since coming into the league right now. Just a couple more. I think he's playing a few more defensive scenarios than Luke Hughes is. Luke Hughes playing on that first power play line right now. And then the goalie situation for the Devils is obviously really tricky right now. Vanacek and Schmidt have both been probably the worst part of this Devils team so far this season, especially in the first half of the season when they were going through, you know, periods where they weren't winning a ton of games. You could really look at the goaltending because the offense was there and they were scoring a lot of goals, and I don't think their defensive play was that poor either, considering the defensemen they have and looking at their analytics, their expected goals against. So a lot of that falls on the goalies, but Nico Daws has actually been great, just played fantastic in a win over the Florida Panthers where he they're the sole reason he won that game, because they got outshot by like 14 or 15 shots there. So Nico Daws, potentially, who knows if he takes over the starters crease, but he certainly will get a lot more starts here moving forward. So if you need a goalie to pick up, I don't think that's terrible, because you'll get a bunch of shots or saves if it's included in your league settings, and then the Devils will still be able to prevail with some wins as well as their team gets healthier. So those are the 5 hardest teams with the remaining schedules this season. All right, thank you guys for tuning in. Let me know what you thought of the 5 teams with the easiest schedules, 5 teams with the hardest schedules. If there's any other questions you have about any of these teams or any other of your players, be sure to comment below, like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video for Fantasy Hockey Mailbag.